Lockdown restrictions being eased somewhat, many of those couples that had planned to actually be married over the past year may get back into planning those weddings. But of course there are some things, some legalities they need to be thinking about. It's very common for South African couples to first enter a customary marriage without an antenuptial contract. Now the practice is then followed by a civil marriage, which then comes with an antenuptial contract. All marriages in South Africa are in community of property unless a valid antenuptial contract is executed before the date of marriage. Sounds very complicated, doesn't it? Well, to help us unpack the legalities and options that are available to you if you are planning a wedding, Hopewell Sathekge is director at Lawtons Africa. Let's find out from him how this all works. Hopewell, good morning, and thanks so much for your time. Yes, and of course a lot of people might be rushing now to get to those weddings that they couldn't actually get to over the past year or so, and you know, the excitement is mounting, but we very rarely stop to think about the legalities of all of this and the paperwork. It's not very pretty sometimes as well. So tell us why it's important to actually think about where we are in the matrimonial property system. That's the term that's being used, and the amendments to that. Why is it important that we know what's going on?
Yeah, thank you, Uveka. So, I mean, before you enter into a marriage, you need to decide whether you're going to get married in community of property or out of community of property, with or without their crew. And for that to happen, you need to decide before the marriage. And when you don't do that before, then you find yourself married in community of property, for example, if you don't enter into an eNCA.
Okay, so we are talking about the amendment of the of a matrimonial property system. So, like you said, this would only apply to couples that are planning to get married, that are in the process, or could it affect existing married couples as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So, to touch back on the point, if you decided on a particular matrimonial property regime, you can't change it after you get married. So then, in that instance, you can only do so by applying to court and having your matrimonial property regime changed. So then comes in the Recognition of Customary Marriages Act, which throws a spanner in the works, as it were.
So, I mean, what would matter in a case like that? Say, you know, somebody hasn't thought this through, and then they're about to get married, say this weekend, for example, and they haven't worked out the nitty-gritty. Obviously, if both partners are on the same page, it shouldn't be a problem, but you still need a court stamp to this. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. In terms of the Matrimonial Property Act, it specifies that for you, if you want to change your matrimonial regime once it has been entered into, you need to apply to court in terms of Section 20 or in terms of Section 21. So what we call a post-nuptial contract, where you've entered into a customary marriage and then you apply via court order. So in terms of Section 21, quickly, you need to advertise for that creditors are aware what's going on before you can change your matrimonial property regime.
So for somebody who's about to sort of get married and they are now busy planning what to do, what are the questions they need to be asking themselves, you know, these two people? What are the things they need to have in order for their arrangement?
Yeah, so you need to decide whether you want to have a joint estate. A joint estate would be when you're married in community of property, or you need to have a separate estate. And this is particularly important for people that are in business, whereas in community of property, for example, you can't sign a surety without the consent of the other spouse, as it were.
So, do go on, Hopewell, yes?
Yeah, so these are the sort of like things you need to decide, whether for example, if you take out a credit, if you take out a loan, for example, and all those sort of things, you can't do that without the consent of your spouse and the likes.
So when it comes to customary marriages here now, like we say, you have the customary ceremony that happens, and then then it becomes a civil marriage. How long in between that, those two ceremonies or those two events, does this need to be put in order?
So most of the time, and it's a very common practice, is that people get married in terms of customary law, and they conclude the marriage and they don't enter into an antenuptial contract, because they're thinking that they only need to enter into an antenuptial contract before the civil marriage, which is actually not the case. Because if you do a customary marriage before, or if you do a customary marriage and you don't enter into an antenuptial contract, then you are married in community of property. And then you find people then sign an ANC or an antenuptial contract before the civil marriage, and then they regard themselves as married out of community of property. And so in that scenario, you find that you were married in terms of in community of property, and then you then change without a court order to a civil marriage out of community of property.
Well, Hopewell, this is not completely just a sort of cold, on paper, sort of legal process.
Yeah.
There's lots of emotions, and I'm sure that you deal with this, with having to tell couples, but really you should protect yourself, or you should protect yourself in a case like this, because nobody ever thinks divorce when they're getting married, right? So that you're not thinking about what's going to happen. So I think just some words of caution and some advice to couples who are about to take the plunge as to just what they should be taking into consideration for themselves to protect themselves in this.
Yeah, so I'm glad you touched on that, in that getting married in community of property is not necessarily about divorce. There's also death that's involved. I mean, death is inevitable. So you find that one of the spouses passes on, and then there's the issues that need to be resorted and dealt with in terms of the estate. So I think you need to have honest conversation. That's the advice that I can give with your potential spouse, and decide what exactly is it that you need. So if you're going to get married customarily, I would advise that you enter into an antenuptial contract before you even conclude the customary marriage, if that's the intention, to get married out of community of property.
And I think more than ever over the past year, we have learned that you need to consider, possible death, and then that's been sort of, I think, the most used word over the past year, one of them especially. So thanks so much for that, Hopewell Sathekge. Just, I think, valuable advice there for those who are now planning with their weddings again. And of course, if you are in a marriage already and you need to make some changes, he's given us some advice on how we would actually do that as well.